racist white woman sees a black mother and daughter selling lemonade in her neighborhood, and she calls the police. However, she is shocked at what the officers do when they arrive. Tanya Davis stood by the front door, one hand holding Zoe's tiny lemonade sign, the other holding a large pitcher of lemonade. The sun was already high, promising a sweltering day ahead, but that didn't dampen Zoe's spirits. The 7-year-old was buzzing with excitement, bouncing on her toes as she placed cups and napkins on the small folding table they had dragged out to the edge of their front yard. "Mom, do you think people will come by? Like, a lot of people?" Zoe asked, her eyes wide and hopeful. Tanya smiled, setting down the pitcher. "I'm sure they will. Who could resist lemonade on a day like this?" She handed Zoe the sign. "Here, put this up, and we're ready to go." Zoe took the sign and eagerly stuck it. The words, "Fresh Lemonade, 1, were scrawled in Zoe's careful handwriting, each letter decorated with little doodles of lemons and smiley faces. "Perfect," Tanya said, her voice filled with pride. She glanced at the clear sky, already feeling the heat seep into her skin. "It's going to be a hot one. You'll have lots of thirsty customers today." Zoe grinned, hopping back to the table, her eyes shining with excitement. "I can't wait. I've been thinking about this all week." She adjusted the cups. "Maybe even enough to get that new art kit we saw at the store," Tanya chuckled. "Well, let's start with selling the lemonade first. You can think about what you're going to buy later." As the minutes passed, a few neighbors waved in their direction. An elderly man walking his dog stopped by and bought a cup of lemonade, smiling kindly at Zoe as she poured him a cup. "You've got quite the business going here, young lady," he said, handing her $1. "Keep it up." Zoe beamed, placing the $1. "Thank you, sir," she chirped, clearly proud of her first sale. Tanya stood behind her, quietly watching, letting Zoe take the lead. She wanted her daughter to experience the joy of doing something on her own, of being in charge. It was a small thing, a lemonade stand, but it meant the world to Zoe, and that was enough for Tanya. A few more people trickled by, some stopping for lemonade, others simply smiling and waving. Each time a customer approached, Zoe lit up, eagerly pouring lemonade and thanking them with the politeness her mother had taught her. "Mom, we've already sold 5 cups," Zoe whispered excitedly, as if afraid saying it too loudly would break the magic. "See?" Tanya said with a grin. "I told you it would be a good day for lemonade." Zoe puffed out her chest proudly, adjusting the jar that now held a few crumpled bills. "I'm gonna be rich," Tanya laughed. "Well, maybe not today, but you're doing..." Zoe was in high spirits, and the lemonade stand was doing better than either of them had expected. Tanya glanced up the street, watching the sunlight glint off parked cars and hearing the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. It was peaceful, and for a moment everything felt just right. But beneath the surface, Tanya couldn't shake the small knot of unease in her stomach. This neighborhood had always been a bit tense, mostly nice people, but there were always looks, always. She had grown used to it, but Zoe hadn't, and as much as she wanted to protect her daughter from the harsh realities of the world, Tanya knew that eventually, Zoe would have to see it for herself. Still, today wasn't the day for those lessons. Today was for lemonade and laughter, for watching her daughter run her first little business. Whatever else came their way, Tanya was determined to keep this day a happy one for Zoe. "Here comes another customer," Zoe whispered, her voice brimming with excitement. Tanya looked up and saw an older woman approaching from down the street, walking slowly with a slight hunch in her back. She recognized her as Helen McAdams, the woman who lived in the house across from them. Helen didn't come out much, and when she did, she never looked particularly happy. "Okay," Tanya said quietly, watching. "Be polite, like you've been." Zoe nodded eagerly, straightening her posture and putting on her best business face, ready to welcome the next customer. Tanya watched the old woman approach, the knot in her stomach tightening ever so slightly. But for now, it was just another customer. Another day in the neighborhood, Helen McAdams walked slowly down the sidewalk, her eyes narrowed against the bright sunlight. She wore a faded floral dress that hung loosely on her frail frame, and her white hay. As she approached the lemonade stand, her lips thinned into a tight line. There was no smile, no friendly greeting, just the air of someone looking for something to be annoyed about. Tanya noticed the change in Zoe's posture as Helen came closer. Zoe's excitement faltered, her smile shrinking just a little, but she kept her hands folded in front of her, standing at attention like the proud little business owner she wanted to be. Tanya gave her a reassuring glance but said nothing, choosing to let the moment unfold. Helen finally reached the stand and stopped in front of the table, her eyes moving slowly from the pitcher of lemonade to the cups, and then landing on Zoe with a frown. "Well," she said, her voice sharp, "what do we have here?" Zoe, her voice still bright but a little more hesitant, spoke up. "It's a lemonade stand, ma'am. Would you like to buy a cup? It's only $1. Helen's eyes flicked over to Tanya for the first time, and the expression on her face hardened further. A lemonade stand? Do you have a permit to be selling anything here? Tanya felt the knot in her stomach tighten, but kept her voice calm and steady. It's just a lemonade stand, Mrs. McAdams. Zoe wanted to have a little fun today, make some lemonade and meet the neighbors. We're not causing any trouble. Helen raised an eyebrow, her gaze sharp and judgmental. No permit, then. That's what I thought. Tanya didn't respond right away, weighing her words carefully. She had been in this situation before, dealing with people who used rules as a thin veil for something else, something uglier, but she didn't want to jump to conclusions. Not yet. It's a simple lemonade stand, Tanya repeated, her tone polite but firm. We're just having a bit of fun, Mrs. McAdams. Helen's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. Fun, huh? Well, the law is the law. You can't just set up shop wherever you like. You need a permit for these things. Otherwise, anyone could come by and set up whatever they wanted on the street. Zoe, sensing the tension but not quite understanding it, looked up at her mother with a confused expression. Mom, do we really need a permit? Tanya knelt down to Zoe's level, her voice soft but clear. No, sweetie. Not for something small like this. We're not doing anything wrong. Helen snorted, crossing her arms over her chest. That's what you say, but the law's the law. You should take this down before someone reports you. You never know what kind of trouble you might cause. Zoe's confusion deepened, her small voice barely above a whisper. But why, Mom? It's just lemonade. Tanya stood up, her gaze steady on Helen's face. She knew exactly where this was heading now. It wasn't about permits. It was never about permits. But she wouldn't let Helen rattle her, not in front of Zoe. Mrs. McAdams, Tanya said evenly, we're just here to enjoy the day. We're not bothering anyone, and we're not doing anything illegal. If you don't want to buy lemonade, that's fine. But we're not taking anything down. Helen's eyes darkened, and her voice took on a sharper edge. Well, we'll see about that. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, and I know when things aren't done properly. I'll be making a call about this. She took a step closer to the table, her eyes narrowing at the pitcher of lemonade. You never know what people are putting in these drinks. I wouldn't trust it. Zoe flinched slightly at the comment, her hands now clenching the hem of her dress. Tanya placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. There's nothing wrong with this lemonade, Tanya said, her voice cool but firm. Zoe made it herself. It's just lemons, water, and sugar. Helen sniffed, her expression unchanging. Well, you never know with some people. Tanya's grip on Zoe's shoulder tightened for a second, but she kept her composure. She wasn't going to let Helen provoke her, not in front of her daughter. Helen turned her gaze back to Zoe, her voice laced with false sweetness. Maybe it's time to pack up, dear. You don't want to cause trouble, do you? Zoe, visibly shaken but trying to stand her ground, shook her head. I don't think we're causing trouble, ma'am. Tanya couldn't stand it any longer. She stepped in front of Zoe, shielding her from Helen's glare. We're fine, Mrs. McAdams. If you have a problem, feel free to call whoever you like, but we're not doing anything wrong. Helen huffed, her face flushed with indignation. She took a step back, casting one more withering glance at the stand. You'll see, she muttered, turning away and walking back toward her house. You'll see. Tanya let out a slow breath as Helen disappeared down the street, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She looked down at Zoe, who was staring after the old woman, her brow furrowed in confusion. Mom, Zoe said quietly. Why did she say that? We're not doing anything wrong, are we? Tanya knelt down again, meeting Zoe's gaze. No, sweetie. We're not doing anything wrong. Some people just have nothing better to do than to make problems where there aren't any. Zoe's frown deepened. But why? She didn't even buy any lemonade. Tanya smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Not everyone's going to be nice, Zoe, but that's their problem, not ours. We're here to have a good day, remember? Zoe nodded, though the confusion didn't fully leave her face. Okay, Mom. Good, Tanya said, giving her a quick hug. Now let's get back to business. The day's not over yet. Zoe smiled a little, though there was still a trace of unease in her eyes. She returned to her spot behind the table, straightening the cups again. Tanya watched her for a moment, her heart aching. She knew that Zoe would eventually have to face more moments like this, moments where the world would seem unfair and unkind. But today, Tanya was determined to protect her as long as she could. They stood there in silence for a few minutes, waiting for the next customer, the shadow of Helen's presence still lingering in the air like a bitter aftertaste. The day had taken a turn, but Tanya wasn't going to let it ruin things. Not yet. The afternoon sun was climbing higher, and despite the earlier tension, the lemonade stand was slowly picking up pace again. Zoe sat behind the table, her posture a little less rigid than before. Though her eyes occasionally flicked toward the street where Helen had disappeared, her smile had returned, but it wasn't as wide or as bright as it had been earlier. Tanya stood beside her, keeping an eye on the neighborhood. She could feel the tension from Helen's visit still hanging in the air, but she didn't want to dwell on it, not in front of Zoe. The day was about her daughter, about giving her the freedom to feel proud and confident, and Tanya wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. A young couple strolled by, hand in hand, and Zoe perked up at the sight of potential customers. She stood a little straighter, putting on her business face again. "Would you like some lemonade?" she called out, her voice bright, but with a hint of the earlier hesitation still lingering. The couple exchanged glances and smiled. "Sure, we'll take 2 cups," the woman said, digging into her purse for some change. Zoe's face lit up again as she poured 2 cups of lemonade, her small hands steady as she handed them over. "That'll be $2, she said, her voice more confident now. The man handed her the money, and Zoe put it into the jar with a small, satisfied smile. "Thank you," she chirped. "Thank you," the woman said warmly. "This is perfect on such a hot day." As the couple walked away, Zoe looked up at her mother, her smile a little wider this time. "See, Mom? We're still doing okay." Tanya nodded, giving her a gentle smile. "I told you we'd be fine." "You're doing great, sweetie." Zoe puffed out her chest a little, her confidence slowly returning. "I've made $10 already," she said proudly, pointing to the jar. "That's fantastic," Tanya said, brushing a lock of hair from Zoe's face. "You're a natural." For a moment, the tension from earlier seemed to lift. The street was quiet again, the faint hum of a lawnmower in the distance, the only sound breaking the silence. Zoe busied herself with rearranging the cups and napkins on the table, her mind now focused back on her lemonade stand, the incident with Helen seemingly fading into the background. But Tanya knew it wasn't gone. Not completely. She could see the way Zoe occasionally glanced down the street, her brow furrowing slightly, as if she were expecting Helen to return at any moment. Tanya sighed inwardly, knowing that today had changed something for Zoe, something that couldn't be fully undone. Zoe broke the silence, her voice softer now. "Mom, why was that lady so mean?" Tanya took a deep breath, kneeling down beside Zoe. "Sometimes, people just aren't happy with themselves, so they try to make other people unhappy too." "But we weren't doing anything wrong," Zoe said, her brow furrowed. "Why did she care so much?" Tanya paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some people, like Mrs. McAdams, just don't understand that not everything needs to be controlled or judged. They see something different, and instead of being kind or ignoring it, they feel like they need to step in." Zoe looked down at the cups, her small hands fidgeting with the edges of the napkins. "But we weren't hurting anyone." "I know, sweetie, and that's what matters," Tanya said, gently lifting Zoe's chin so she could meet her eyes. "We're not doing anything wrong. You're here, working hard, being polite, and making lemonade for people. That's something to be proud of, no matter what someone like Mrs. McAdams says." Zoe nodded slowly, though Tanya could see the wheels turning in her head, her young mind trying to grasp something that felt too big to fully understand. After a moment, Zoe asked, "Do you think she'll come back?" Tanya hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. But even if she does, it doesn't change anything. You're not doing anything wrong, and you don't have to listen to her. Some people just have nothing better to do." Zoe seemed to take comfort in that, though her brow was still slightly furrowed. "Okay," she said quietly, turning back to her lemonade stand. They stood in silence for a while, the warmth of the sun settling over them like a heavy blanket. A few more neighbors walked by, smiling and waving, though none stopped for lemonade. Zoe seemed content again, at least on the surface, but Tanya could tell that the conversation with Helen had left its mark. As another 10 minutes passed without any customers, Zoe fidgeted. "Mom, do you think anyone else is going to buy lemonade?" "I'm sure they will," Tanya said, though she noticed the street had grown quieter as the afternoon heat intensified. "People are probably just staying inside where it's cooler." Zoe nodded but looked disappointed. "I want to sell more. I still need more money for the art kit." Tanya smiled softly. "We've still got time, don't worry." Zoe sighed but didn't say anything, rearranging the cups again, her mind elsewhere. The energy she had started the day with was still there, but it was muted now, tempered by the reality of what had happened with Helen. As they stood in the warm silence, Tanya thought about what to say next, how to guide Zoe through this moment without crushing her spirit. She wanted her daughter to understand the world, but not at the expense of her innocence. Not yet. "Hey," Tanya said, her voice soft. "You're doing great, Zoe, and no matter what anyone says, I'm really proud of you." Zoe looked up, her eyes softening. "Thanks, Mom. And don't let Mrs. McAdams or anyone else make you feel like you're doing something wrong when you're not," Tanya continued. "Some people are just unhappy, and that has nothing to do with you." Zoe nodded again, more firmly this time. "Okay, I won't." "Good," Tanya said, giving her a quick smile. "Now let's see if we can get a few more customers before the day's over." Zoe grinned, her energy picking up again. "Yeah, I bet I can sell at least 5 more cups. That's the spirit, Tanya said, her heart warming at Zoe's determination. The day wasn't perfect, but it wasn't ruined either. Despite Helen's sour presence, Zoe was still standing, still determined to keep going, and for now, that was enough. The sun had shifted in the sky, casting longer shadows across the street as the afternoon wore on. Tanya and Zoe continued to stand at their lemonade table, patiently waiting for more customers. Zoe was still cheerful, but her earlier enthusiasm had dimmed just slightly. They had sold a few more cups, but the flow of people passing by had slowed in the heat. Tanya wiped the sweat from her forehead, looking up and down the quiet street. She was just about to suggest to Zoe that they take a short break inside when she noticed a police car slowly turning onto their block. Her body tensed immediately, an automatic reaction she had long learned to suppress, but still felt in moments like these. The car came to a stop a few feet away from their lemonade stand. 2 officers stepped out. One, a tall white man with a serious expression, and the other, a shorter Latina woman with a calm, friendly demeanor. They both wore dark sunglasses, and the heat shimmered off the pavement beneath their polished black shoes. Tanya felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to stay calm. Zoe, noticing the sudden presence of the police, looked up at her mother with wide eyes. "Mom, why are the police here?" Tanya took a deep breath, kneeling down next to her daughter. "It's okay, sweetie. Just stay calm and let me handle it, okay?" Zoe nodded, though her eyes betrayed the fear creeping in. She moved closer to her mother, instinctively reaching for her hand. The officers approached the lemonade stand, and the taller one, Officer Jenkins, spoke first. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "We received a complaint about a business operating without a permit." Tanya stood up slowly, keeping her voice steady. "It's just a lemonade stand," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "My daughter and I are just trying to enjoy the day. We're not causing any problems." Officer Lopez, the Latina woman, gave Zoe a small, reassuring smile before speaking. "We understand, ma'am, but we did get a call from someone in the neighborhood. They were concerned that you didn't have the proper permit to be selling anything on the street." Tanya's grip on Zoe's hand tightened slightly. "It's just a small stand. We're not running a business. Zoe just wanted to sell lemonade for the afternoon." The 2 officers exchanged a glance, their expressions softening slightly. Officer Jenkins sighed and shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "We're not trying to give you a hard time, ma'am," he said, his tone a bit gentler now. "But when someone calls in a complaint, we have to follow up." Zoe, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice small and trembling. "Are we in trouble?" Officer Lopez immediately knelt down to Zoe's level, her voice soft and kind. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble. We just have to make sure everything is okay. That's all." Tanya felt her heart break a little at the sight of her daughter's wide, scared eyes. Zoe was just a child, standing there in her yellow dress, selling lemonade. She shouldn't have to feel this fear, shouldn't have to worry about the police showing up over something so simple. But here they were. "We're really not doing anything wrong," Zoe said softly, clutching her mother's hand a little tighter. "We just wanted to sell lemonade." "I know," Officer Lopez said gently. "You're doing a great job too. It's just that sometimes people make complaints and we have to check on them. But I'm sure everything is fine." Just as the tension seemed to be settling, a voice broke through the still air, sharp and cold. "There they are. I told you they were out here causing trouble." Tanya's heart sank as Helen McAdams came marching down the street toward them, her face twisted in a self-satisfied scowl. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her eyes burned with that same bitter fury from earlier. "You see," Helen said, addressing the officers, "I told you they didn't have a permit. I've lived in this neighborhood for decades, and I won't stand for this kind of thing going on right outside my house." Zoe flinched at Helen's harsh words, and Tanya instinctively pulled her closer, shielding her daughter from the old woman's hateful gaze. "Mrs. McAdams," Officer Jenkins said, raising a hand in a calming gesture, "we're handling it." Helen wasn't done. She stepped closer, pointing a crooked finger at the lemonade stand. "You never know what people like that are putting in those drinks. There could be anything in there. It's dangerous." Tanya's breath caught in her throat, her anger building under the surface. She had done her best to stay calm all day, to let Helen's words roll off her, but now she was standing here, accusing her daughter of, what? Poisoning lemonade? Zoe, already on edge, shrank even further behind her mother. Her small voice trembled as she whispered, "Mom, what does she mean? What's in the lemonade?" Tanya closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. She wouldn't give Helen the satisfaction of losing her composure. She wouldn't let her daughter see her crack under the weight of this woman's bigotry. "There's nothing in the lemonade, Zoe," Tanya said softly, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eyes. "It's just lemonade, like we made together this morning. Don't listen to her." Officer Lopez, who had been watching the interaction carefully, stepped forward. Mrs. McAdams, please. There's no need to escalate this situation. We've spoken with them, and everything is under control. But Helen wasn't backing down. You don't know them, she snapped. You don't know what they're capable of. Tanya had had enough. She straightened up and stepped in front of Zoe, her voice calm but laced with steel. Mrs. McAdams, we've done nothing wrong. You've made your complaint, the officers have investigated, and we're not going anywhere. Officer Jenkins, sensing the rising tension, stepped between the two women. Ma'am, he said to Helen, we're asking you to step back. This isn't going to solve anything. Helen glared at him but finally took a step back, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. Fine, she muttered, but I'll be watching. Satisfied that she had made her point, Helen finally turned and stormed back toward her house, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. The tension in the air lingered for a moment longer, but as soon as Helen disappeared around the corner, Officer Lopez let out a slow breath. I'm really sorry about that, she said, turning to Tanya and Zoe. Tanya nodded, her voice tight with controlled anger. I appreciate you handling it. Officer Jenkins glanced down at the lemonade stand, his expression softening. Look, he said, his tone now almost apologetic. We're not going to make you shut it down, but officially, we have to ask that you do so, just to keep the peace. Tanya's heart sank, but before she could respond, Zoe's voice piped up, her words shaky but defiant. But we didn't do anything wrong. Officer Jenkins knelt down, his face level with Zoe's. I know, kiddo, you didn't, but sometimes, to keep people like her from causing more trouble, we have to ask you to do things that aren't fair. Zoe looked confused, and Tanya's heart ached at the lesson her daughter was learning today. So, we have to take it down? Zoe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Lopez glanced at Officer Jenkins before stepping forward, a small smile on her lips. Technically, yes, but between us, she said, leaning in slightly, you can keep it going for a little while longer. Just keep it quiet, okay? Zoe's face lit up slightly at the officer's kindness, and Officer Jenkins reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled dollar bill. How about a cup of lemonade for me and my partner before we go? Tanya's tight chest loosened a little as she watched Zoe eagerly pour 2 cups of lemonade, handing them over to the officers with a small, proud smile. Here you go, she said softly. Thanks, kid, Officer Jenkins said, taking a sip. This is really good lemonade. The officers waved goodbye as they walked back to their car, and Zoe watched them leave, her hand still gripping the lemonade pitcher. For a moment, the street was quiet again. Tanya knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a gentle hug. See? Everything's okay. Zoe nodded slowly, her voice small but steady. Okay, Mom. They stood there in the quiet, knowing that the day wasn't over, and neither was the lesson. The police car had barely turned the corner before Zoe started to relax again. She gave her mother a tentative smile, her small shoulders no longer tight with tension. Tanya squeezed Zoe's hand gently, offering a reassuring nod. The officers had been kind, and in the end, it felt like a small victory. But Tanya couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things weren't quite over yet. Do you think we'll get more customers now, Mom? Zoe asked, her voice softer than usual but hopeful. Tanya smiled, smoothing down her daughter's hair. Maybe, sweetie. We'll see. They resumed their positions behind the lemonade stand. Zoe busied herself by rearranging the cups, trying to focus on her next sale, rather than the lingering anxiety from the police visit. Tanya watched her daughter carefully, proud of how resilient she had been so far, but also worried about how much more she might have to endure. Just as Tanya began to relax, her worst fear materialized. From down the street came the familiar clicking of heels against the pavement, and before Tanya even turned, she knew who it was. Helen McAdams was back, moving faster than before, her face twisted with anger. Tanya's stomach tightened, and Zoe froze at the sound of Helen's approach. The little girl's hand clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. There she is again, Helen's voice sliced through the air, sharp and grating. I knew you wouldn't listen. Just as I expected, Tanya turned, her expression calm but firm. She stepped in front of Zoe, shielding her from the old woman's harsh glare. Mrs. McAdams, we've already spoken to the police. They said everything was fine. Helen stopped just a few feet from the stand, crossing her arms over her chest. Her lips curled into a sneer. Fine, huh? That's what they told you? Well, let me tell you something. I know how these things work. You people always try to get around the rules. You think you can just set up wherever you like, doing whatever you want. Tanya's breath hitched slightly, but she kept her tone steady. We're not breaking any rules. We're just here selling lemonade, Mrs. McAdams. Zoe peeked out from behind her mother, her voice trembling. We didn't do anything wrong. Helen's eyes landed on Zoe, her expression hardening. You stay quiet, little girl. You don't understand how the world works yet. Tanya stepped forward, her voice now laced with warning. That's enough, Mrs. McAdams. We're not going to entertain this any longer. Helen ignored Tanya, her focus still on Zoe. You need to learn that people like you don't just get to do whatever you want. This is a respectable neighborhood. There are rules, and if your mother won't teach you, then I guess it's up to the rest of us to remind you where you belong. Zoe's eyes filled with tears, her small frame trembling beside the table. Tanya's heart ached as she watched her daughter shrink under the weight of the hateful words. She took a deep breath, her own emotions swirling inside her. But this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. I've had enough, Helen, Tanya said, her voice steady but firm. She stepped forward, no longer backing down. You've made your point. You think you're better than us, but the truth is, you're just a bitter, hateful woman who can't stand seeing anyone else happy. You've spent all day trying to tear us down, but it won't work. Helen's eyes widened in shock, clearly unused to being spoken to in this way. She opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya wasn't finished. You can call the police as many times as you want. You can keep spewing your hate, but it won't change anything, Tanya continued. We're not going anywhere, and neither you nor anyone else in this neighborhood is going to tell us we don't belong, Helen spluttered, her face flushing with anger. How dare you? How dare you? Tanya interrupted, her voice now rising. How dare you try to make my daughter feel small? She's done nothing wrong. She's just a little girl selling lemonade, and you've been harassing her all day. What kind of person does that? Zoe watched in awe, her mother's words cutting through the air like a shield protecting her from Helen's hatred. Helen took a step back, her confidence visibly shaken. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. I'm just trying to make sure the neighborhood stays. Stays what, Helen? Tanya cut in, her eyes fierce. Stays the way you want it? Where people like us are quiet and don't make any noise? That's not how the world works anymore. The silence that followed was thick with tension. But Tanya stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Helen looked around as if expecting someone to back her up, but the street was empty. The few neighbors who had walked by earlier were nowhere to be seen. She was alone in her bitterness, and it showed in the way her shoulders sagged. After what felt like an eternity, Helen finally turned away, muttering under her breath, "This isn't over." But Tanya knew it was. She had stood her ground, and Helen had nothing left to say. As Helen retreated back to her house, Zoe exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She looked up at her mother, her eyes wide with admiration. "Mom, you were amazing." Tanya knelt down beside her, pulling Zoe into a gentle hug. "I just did what I had to do, sweetie. No one gets to treat you like that. No one." Zoe's voice was soft but steady. "But why does she hate us so much?" Tanya sighed, brushing a tear from Zoe's cheek. "Some people are just scared of what they don't understand. They think they can make the world better by making others feel small. But that's not true. What matters is that we know who we are, and we don't let people like her make us feel less." Zoe nodded, sniffling but looking stronger. "We're not doing anything wrong." "That's right," Tanya said, her voice filled with love. "We're not, and don't you ever forget that." The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow across the neighborhood. The street, now quiet again, felt different, lighter somehow, as if the air had been cleared of something dark and oppressive. Tanya stood up, holding Zoe's hand as they looked at the lemonade stand, still standing tall despite the day's events. They had endured more than they should have, but they were still here, and they were still standing. "Do you want to pack up now?" Tanya asked, her voice gentle. Zoe shook her head, a small smile forming on her lips. "No, Mom. I think I want to sell a few more cups before it gets dark." Tanya chuckled softly, feeling a wave of pride wash over her. "That's my girl." They stood side by side, ready for whatever came next, knowing that no matter what happened, they had each other, and that was more than enough. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as Tanya and Zoe remained at their lemonade stand. Despite everything that had happened, Zoe's spirit seemed to have lifted once more. There was a quiet determination in her, the kind of strength Tanya had hoped she would find today but never imagined it would come at such a cost. As the street fell into a peaceful lull, Tanya felt a momentary relief wash over her. The tension from Helen's confrontation still lingered, but Helen was gone now, retreated into her house. They had stood their ground, and Tanya was proud of how Zoe had handled it all. Still, the day had weighed heavy on both of them. "Mom," Zoe said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think she'll come back again?" Tanya glanced down at her daughter, seeing the mixture of innocence and wisdom in her eyes. Zoe had learned too much too fast today, and it pained Tanya to know that these lessons were necessary. "No, sweetie, I think we've seen the last of Mrs. McAdams for today." Zoe nodded but still looked uncertain. "I hope so. I didn't like how she made me feel." Tanya knelt beside Zoe, her voice gentle but firm. "And you don't have to let her make you feel that way. She said some very mean things, but they don't define who you are. You know that, right? Zoe looked up at her mother, her eyes shining with a quiet resilience. Yeah, I know. I won't let her make me feel small. That's right, Tanya said, smiling softly. You're stronger than that. Just then, the sound of footsteps approached, and Tanya instinctively stood, turning to see Officer Jenkins and Officer Lopez walking back up the street toward them. Tanya's heart skipped a beat for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But Zoe's face brightened slightly when she recognized the officers. Hey there, Officer Lopez called as they neared the stand, her tone light and friendly. Still at it, huh? Tanya smiled, feeling some of the tension ease from her body. Yep, we're still here. Officer Jenkins stepped forward, his eyes scanning the lemonade stand before landing on Zoe. So, how's the business going, young lady? Zoe grinned, the weight of the day slowly lifting as she stood a little taller. We've sold a lot of lemonade. Officer Lopez chuckled softly. That's great to hear. I'm glad to see you didn't let today's little interruption get you down. Tanya caught the knowing glance Officer Lopez shot her way, and she appreciated the subtle acknowledgement of what had happened earlier. We're doing okay, Tanya said, nodding. Thank you for coming by again. Officer Jenkins shifted on his feet, his expression softer now. Listen, we know today's been tough, and I wish we didn't have to ask, but we do have to make it official. Tanya's heart sank a little, but she kept her expression neutral. Official? Officer Jenkins sighed. Technically, we have to ask you to pack up the lemonade stand. You know, just to keep the peace and avoid any more incidents. Zoe's face fell at his words, the excitement she had just regained slipping away. But we didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, her voice small and full of disappointment. Tanya felt her own frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but before she could speak, Officer Lopez knelt down beside Zoe, her tone gentle and kind. I know, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong at all, but sometimes, to avoid more trouble from people like Mrs. McAdams, we have to follow the rules even when they don't seem fair. Zoe's brow furrowed as she tried to understand. So we have to take it down? Officer Jenkins knelt too, his voice quiet. Just for now, but between us, he added, leaning in a little closer, you don't really have to stop. Just be a bit more careful, okay? Keep it quiet, and you'll be fine. Zoe blinked, her confusion melting into a small smile as she realized what they were saying. So, we don't have to take it down. Officer Lopez grinned, standing up again. Not if you don't want to. Just keep a low profile and you'll be okay. Tanya felt a rush of gratitude toward the officers for their kindness. She nodded her thanks, and Zoe's spirits lifted once again. Officer Jenkins reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled dollar bills. Now, how about another cup of that famous lemonade? Zoe's smile grew wider as she eagerly poured 2 cups, handing them to the officers with pride. Here you go. Officer Jenkins took a sip, nodding appreciatively. Best lemonade I've had all day. Officer Lopez laughed, taking a sip from her cup as well. She's got a real talent, that's for sure. They stood together for a moment, the tension from earlier fading into the background, as they shared a few light-hearted exchanges. Zoe seemed back to her old self, and Tanya felt a sense of relief knowing that the day had turned around, even just a little. We'll be heading out now, Officer Jenkins said, handing Zoe another $1. But you two keep going, okay? You're doing great. Tanya nodded, smiling warmly. Thank you, both of you. Officer Lopez gave Zoe a wink before turning to follow her partner. Take care, Zoe. Keep up the good work. As the officers walked back to their car, Tanya watched them leave, feeling a mix of emotions. The day had been full of ups and downs, but in this quiet moment, standing beside her daughter, she felt something close to peace. Zoe looked up at her mother, her face thoughtful. Mom, why did they say we had to take it down if we don't really have to? Tanya knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from Zoe's face. Sometimes people just want to avoid conflict. It's not always fair, but they were trying to help us keep things from getting worse. Zoe nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words. So, we can still sell lemonade? Tanya smiled, feeling the warmth of her daughter's resilience. Yes, we can still sell lemonade. We just have to be smart about it. Zoe grinned, her confidence fully restored. Good. I want to sell more before it gets dark. Tanya stood up, giving Zoe a gentle pat on the back. Then let's keep going, sweetie. And with that, they resumed their spots at the stand, ready for whatever came next. They had weathered the storm, and though the day had been hard, they were still standing, together. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Tanya and Zoe continued with their lemonade stand, the quiet sense of triumph settling between them. Zoe's spirits were high again, and Tanya was grateful for the officer's kindness, which had helped diffuse the tension from earlier. They were on their way to wrapping up the day, feeling like they had weathered the storm. But just as they were about to pack up, the sharp sound of footsteps echoed down the street. Tanya's body tensed instantly, Recognizing the familiar, angry clatter of Helen McAdams' shoes, she turned slowly, her heart sinking, and saw Helen storming toward them with even more rage than before, her face red and twisted with fury. Zoe froze, her small hands clutching the edge of the table. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling again. Tanya placed a hand on Zoe's shoulder, squeezing gently. "It's okay, sweetie, I'm here." Helen stopped in front of the stand, her eyes blazing as she glared at Tanya. "I told you to take this down," she spat, her voice louder than ever, shaking with rage. "You think you can just ignore the rules? I spoke to the police, and they said you were supposed to pack this up. Yet here you are, still out here, flaunting your disrespect for this neighborhood." Zoe shrank back, but Tanya didn't move. Her eyes locked on Helen's, and for the first time all day, she felt the last thread of patience snap. "Helen," Tanya began, her voice calm but steely, "we're not doing anything wrong. We've already spoken to the police. They said everything was fine." Helen's face contorted further, her fists clenching at her sides. "Don't you lie to me. I know how people like you operate. You're always trying to find a way around the rules. You think you can just do whatever you want, without any consequences. Not in this neighborhood, not while I'm still here." Tanya took a step forward, her posture straight and unwavering. "This has nothing to do with the rules, and you know it," she said, her voice firm and steady. "You don't care about a permit or the neighborhood. You care about control. You care about making us feel small." Zoe looked up at her mother, wide-eyed as she stood her ground. Tanya's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of all that had been left unsaid. Helen's eyes narrowed into slits. "You don't belong here. You and your daughter, you're not like the rest of us, and you need to understand your place." Tanya's jaw clenched, but she forced herself to remain composed. "No," she said, her voice strong. "We're not like you, and thank God for that." Helen opened her mouth to respond, but Tanya didn't let her. "You've spent all day trying to tear us down, trying to make my daughter feel like she doesn't belong in her own neighborhood," Tanya continued, her voice rising slightly with emotion. "But guess what, Helen? We do belong here. We have every right to be here, just as much as you do. And nothing you say or do will change that." Zoe, still holding onto the table, watched her mother with awe. The fear that had gripped her earlier seemed to be loosening, replaced by something else, something stronger. Helen's face flushed with anger, but her words faltered. "You don't understand how things work. You can't just—" "I understand perfectly well how things work," Tanya said, cutting her off again. "People like you think you can bully us, scare us, into being quiet. But I'm done being quiet. I'm done letting people like you make me, or my daughter, feel like we don't have a place here." For a moment, the two women stared at each other in a tense silence, the air between them charged with all the unspoken history, all the injustices that Tanya had learned to endure over the years. But now, in front of her daughter, she refused to endure any longer. Zoe's voice, small but steady, broke the silence. "We didn't do anything wrong." Tanya turned to her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Zoe stood beside her, her hands no longer trembling, her chin raised just a little higher. "We're just selling lemonade," Zoe continued, her voice growing more confident. "We're not hurting anyone." Tanya looked back at Helen, her eyes blazing with quiet defiance. "You've had your say, Helen. Now it's time for you to leave." Helen's face twisted with fury, but there was something else there too, something like uncertainty. She had come back expecting to find Tanya defeated, expecting to impose her will once again. But now, standing in the face of Tanya's quiet defiance, Helen seemed smaller. "You'll regret this," Helen spat, but her voice lacked the force it had before. She took a step back, her shoulders slumping slightly. "You'll see." Tanya didn't respond. She simply stood there, unmoving, watching as Helen turned and walked away, her heels clicking loudly on the pavement. Zoe stayed quiet, her eyes following Helen as she disappeared down the street. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension that had filled the air seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a strange, almost eerie calm. Tanya let out a slow breath, kneeling down beside Zoe. "You okay?" Zoe nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. "Yeah, I think so." Tanya pulled her daughter into a hug, holding her close. "I'm so proud of you, Zoe. You were so brave." Zoe hugged her back tightly, her small arms wrapped around her mother. "You were brave too, Mom." They stayed like that for a moment, the quiet of the evening settling around them like a warm blanket. The street was empty now, and the sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun began to set. After a while, Tanya pulled back, brushing a strand of hair from Zoe's face. "No one gets to tell you that you don't belong. Remember that, okay?" Zoe nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "Okay, Mom, I'll remember." Tanya smiled, standing up and taking a deep breath. "Now, how about we pack up for the day? I think we've had enough excitement." Zoe grinned, her energy returning. Yeah, but maybe we can sell lemonade again tomorrow? Tanya chuckled softly, shaking her head. We'll see, sweetie, we'll see. As they began to pack up the lemonade stand, Tanya couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Today had been hard, harder than it should have been, but they had faced it together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. And for now, that was enough. The sun had nearly set by the time Tanya and Zoe finished packing up the lemonade stand. The warm hues of twilight blanketed the neighborhood, casting a soft glow over everything. Tanya folded the small table and stacked the empty cups, while Zoe carefully gathered the leftover napkins and the jar of money they'd earned throughout the day. Zoe was quieter than usual, her brow furrowed slightly, as if she was deep in thought. Tanya could tell that the events of the day were still weighing on her daughter. After everything that had happened, the run-ins with Helen, the police, and the final confrontation, Zoe had been remarkably strong, but Tanya knew that strength didn't erase the confusion and questions swirling in her young mind. Tanya placed the folded table under her arm, then looked down at Zoe. Ready to head inside, sweetie? Zoe nodded, still looking pensive. She held the jar close to her chest, as though it was the one piece of the day that made sense to her. Mom, can I ask you something? Tanya knelt down beside Zoe, placing the table down for a moment. Of course, Zoe. What's on your mind? Zoe hesitated, her small fingers tracing the rim of the jar. Why was Mrs. McAdams so mean? I mean, we didn't do anything to her, and she still hated us. Why? Tanya sighed softly. She had known this question was coming, and she had dreaded the day she'd have to explain the ugliness of the world to her daughter. But Zoe had seen it now. There was no hiding from it, and Tanya believed in being honest, even when the truth was hard. She gently took the jar from Zoe and set it on the ground beside her. Then, she looked into Zoe's wide, questioning eyes. Some people, like Mrs. McAdams, are afraid of what they don't understand. They think that people who look different or act different don't belong. And instead of being kind, they choose to be mean and hurtful because it makes them feel more powerful. Zoe frowned, her small face scrunched up with confusion. But we didn't do anything wrong. Why would she hate us just because we're different? Tanya took a deep breath, searching for the right words. You're right, Zoe. We didn't do anything wrong, and that's the hardest part to understand. Sometimes people don't need a reason to be mean. It's not about what we did. It's about how she sees the world. She thinks that people who aren't like her don't deserve the same respect. Zoe's eyes filled with sadness as she looked down at her hands. So, it's because we're different from her? Tanya nodded, her heart aching for her daughter. Yes, sweetie. It's because of that. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with being different. In fact, being different is what makes us special. Zoe looked back up at her mother, her brow still furrowed. But why does it have to be like that? Why can't everyone just be nice? Tanya smiled sadly. I wish I had a better answer for you, Zoe. I wish everyone could just be kind to each other, no matter what we look like or where we come from. But the truth is, some people carry a lot of fear and anger inside them, and they let that fear turn into hate. Zoe was quiet for a moment, her little face deep in thought. So what do we do? How do we make it stop? Tanya reached out and gently placed her hand on Zoe's shoulder. We stand up for ourselves, like we did today, and we keep being kind, even when others aren't. We show people that their hate won't break us. Zoe blinked up at her mother, her expression softening. Like how you didn't let Mrs. McAdams make you stop selling lemonade. Tanya smiled, feeling a swell of pride in her chest. Exactly, Zoe. We didn't let her stop us, and we didn't let her make us feel like we don't belong. Zoe's face brightened a little, though the heaviness still lingered in her eyes. It's just, I didn't like how she made me feel. It's like she was trying to make me feel like I was small, and I don't want to feel that way again. Tanya pulled Zoe into a gentle hug, her arms wrapping protectively around her daughter. You're not small, Zoe. You're strong and you're smart and you're brave. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than that. Zoe rested her head against her mother's shoulder, the warmth of the embrace soothing some of the day's pain. Okay, Mom, I'll try. Tanya kissed the top of Zoe's head, holding her close for a moment longer. That's all you need to do, sweetie. Just remember who you are, and no one can make you feel small. Zoe pulled back slightly, her eyes searching her mother's face. Do you think Mrs. McAdams will ever be nice? Tanya sighed softly, shaking her head. I don't know, Zoe. Some people change, but others don't. All we can do is control how we act, how we treat others, and hope that maybe, someday, she'll see that her hate doesn't make her strong. It makes her weak. Zoe nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something far too big for her young mind to fully grasp. I hope she changes. I don't want to be scared of her. Tanya smiled gently. You don't have to be scared of her. You were brave today, and you stood up for yourself. That's all that matters. Zoe smiled a little, her face finally relaxing as she hugged her mother once more. Thanks, Mom. Tanya hugged her back, feeling the tension of the day slowly slipping away. You're welcome, sweetie. Now how about we head inside and count how much money you made today? Zoe's eyes lit up at the mention of counting her earnings, her worries momentarily replaced with excitement. Yeah, I think we did pretty good. Tanya chuckled softly, standing up and picking up the jar. Let's find out. As they walked back toward the house, the day's lessons still lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of the world Zoe was beginning to understand. But as Tanya watched her daughter skip ahead, her spirit not broken but stronger, she knew they had both learned something important today: resilience in the face of hatred and the power of standing tall. And that, Tanya thought as they stepped inside, was a lesson that would stay with them both for a lifetime.